Have you ever been scrolling through all of YouTube to find a video to help you start your journey in chess? Well, this is the perfect video for you. In this video, we're going to be covering all the essential basics of chess, as well as teaching you how to use the pieces and a few tactics along the way. So let's jump right in. There are 6 different pieces in chess: the pawn, the knight, the bishop, the queen, the king, and the rook. Each of these pieces have their own unique ways of moving, and we're going to cover all of them. Starting with the rook. The rook is probably one of the most straightforward pieces in chess. It moves in straight lines, up and down. As you see here, I have highlighted every potential square that this rook can move to. As I said before, it moves in straight lines only, which means it cannot move to a diagonal, or it cannot move diagonally at all. It would have to move in straight lines. So if it wanted to get to this square that I've highlighted, it would have to move to over here, then back up here, in order to get to the square. That's basically how the rook works. It only moves in straight lines. Now let's test you a little bit. As you can see here, I have placed an enemy rook on this square. Now, how can you attack it? Well, as I said before, you can't move in a diagonal, but you can move in a straight line, which means you can either go up, then to the side, or this way, up to the side. The white piece, or the pieces, don't have to always move one square at a time. If it did, it would make chess really boring. They can move as many squares as they possibly can, but they have to follow the way that they move, the patterns that they move, and they cannot go to an imaginary square on the side of the board. They can't go further than either the H row, as you can see with the letter H, or the A row, or the A rank, or the A column. So I could move to this square here, then back up to capture the rook. Now let's say I wanted to get to this square over here that I've highlighted. Well, I'd have to move in the same way to get there in the shortest amount of time. I'd move over to this square, then onto that square. Now I think you're pretty confident with the rook. So let's move on to the second most straightforward piece in chess, bishop. The bishop is the exact opposite of the rook. It can move only in diagonals. So that means it can only move to these squares right now. This still means it's pretty powerful, as you can still see the entire board. As you can see here, there are many choices for white to move their bishop to. Now, one of the reasons why the bishops aren't as powerful as the rook though, is that it can never cross the dark squares. In this specific bishop's example, you can see that it's on a light square. You probably would have noticed that there are 2 different colors of the square, a lighter color and a darker color. This bishop is on a lighter color. That means that it can only move to light colored squares, like over here, 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 or here. But at the beginning of the game, you start with 2 bishops, one on the light squares and one on the dark squares. This basically means that the dark squared bishop can control all of the dark squares, but none of the light squares, which is the reason you start with 2, so that you can control both the light and dark squares. Now, like I said before, the bishop can move to as many squares as it wants. It can move all the way to the corner, then back across to the other side of the board. Same goes with this bishop. I can move here, I can move here, I can move all the way here. Now, if you can move all the way across the board, it doesn't mean you have to. You can always still move one by one. But in most cases, that will be not a great move, as you're wasting your turns. Now let's move on to the queen. The queen is a special piece. It's the most powerful piece, and for a pretty good reason. Imagine you had a rook and a bishop, and you stack them on top of each other. In summary, that's what a queen is. A queen can move on all of the straight lines, like a rook, but it can also go on all the diagonals, like the bishop. This makes it extraordinarily powerful, as not only can it control dark squares, but also light squares with the combined ability of the rook. So that basically makes it the supreme lord of the board, and you'll see why the king is later. Now, like I said before, the queen is the most powerful piece. It can move to the most squares at the same time. For example, I can go all the way to this side of the board, but then move over one square and move to this side of the board, then go all the way straight up and then end up back here. If I take that route, I go here, all the way down here, all the way up here, and all the way to the side. If I tried that with the bishop, I'd just be stuck on the light squares. There would be no way to get this bishop over to this square. And if I had a rook, I couldn't travel to diagonal squares with such ease. It would take me 2 moves at least, which is quite a waste. Yet the queen can do all that in just 1 move, which is what makes it so powerful. Now let's test you. I placed an enemy queen over this corner. How can we get to there? Well, you can't teleport over to the light square, no. It would still take you 2 moves. But it's better than being with a bishop who can't even go onto the dark squares. The 2 moves would be either to go here, 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 or you could just stay. But the correct move, or the shortest way, would probably be go to the square, as then you have a direct aim and then can capture the queen. Now, if I wanted to get to this square, how would I do it? Well, this one's an easy one, as it can go there directly in 1 move. As you can see here, I have just traveled the entire length of the board. I can do that again and travel all the way to the top here. But I can't go to this square in 1 move. While it may be super duper close, I can't go there in 1 move. It would require 2 moves, as both neither the rook or the bishop can go there in 1 move. It would take 2 at the minimum. I think you're pretty confident with the queen now. Now it's time to move to the last easy piece in my opinion, the king. Now you might be thinking that the king is like superiority, better than the queen, rook, bishop, all combined. But in fact, it's actually the worst piece in the game, yet the most important. This poor king over here can't travel all the way across the board like the queen can, or the rook, or the bishop. In fact, it is stuck in this 1 by 1 in every direction. While it can move in any direction at once, it can only move 1 square at a time. This is the only piece in which you need to move 1 square at a time, with a few exceptions. So that means if I wanted to get to this square, I'd have to go, and go before I finally reached here. And if I wanted to go all the way to the other side of the board, that'd be an even bigger pain. So that's why the king is so weak and terribly slow and powerless. Compare that to a queen. While it took me 8 moves to get there, the queen could have just done it in 1 move, snap. But I have to travel all the way across with 8 moves to get to the other side of the board. And yes, the king just did eat the queen. That doesn't happen in regular chess. So the king is quite weak, but it has a special ability. Well, not ability, but it's sort of like a force field. The 2 kings can never touch. For example, I can never move the king to this square here. It would be an illegal move, because for some reason the kings can't touch. But you can't move to this square next to the king. I don't know why it would happen, probably to prevent you from capturing the king, which we'll see why later on. But right now these 2 kings are just stuck. They can never cross this square. And anytime this king tries to sidestep his way around, it would not work. As you can see here, I cannot go to the square. It won't let me. If I actually try to go to this square, the game won't let me, as you can see here. The board won't let me, and I can never cross this path here. I'm stuck where I am. In short, that's basically how the kings work. They can never touch, and they can always only move 1 square at a time, but in any direction, which still makes them weak. Now it's time to move on to the more complicated pieces, the pawn and the knight. Let's start with the knight. The knight is pretty simple once you've learned it, but when you start, it's actually quite complicated, as it has many mechanics. The knight doesn't move in a straightforward way like this way, vertically, horizontally, or diagonally. Instead, it moves in a very complicated manner. It moves in an L shape. Now, I might be thinking, what does that mean? Does that mean it can travel the whole board like this, or go all the way here, or go all the way here in a diagonal L? Not really. It can move in an L that's 2 squares long and 1 square, or two squares long. It can move in a pattern that's 3 squares long and 2 squares tall, or thick, you could say. As you can see, I can move 1, 2, then here. like this. I traveled from this square, 1, 2, 3, and then from this square to this square here in 2. So that's how the knight works. It can do this in any direction. However, it can't go diagonally. For example, I can't go diagonally 1, 2, and then to this square. That's the bishop's job. But this knight can go 1, 2 here, this square, 1, 2 here to this square, 1, 2 here to this square, 1, 2 to this square, and then the same with the other side, 1, 2, and then to this square. One, 2 to this square, 1, 2 to this square, 1, 2 to this square. This knight can currently move to 8 squares, and it's most powerful at the middle of the board, like with the other pieces. As you might have seen with the king before, this king can only move to these 2 squares, but with this king here, it can only move to this square. The pieces are more powerful in the middle of the board compared to in the corner. If I move the knight all the way to the corner with my magical powers, this knight is stuck. In the middle, it can move to 8 different squares. Here, it's stuck to 2. Only these highlighted squares is where the knight can move to. That's roughly 25% of what it could have moved before. I just want to express that clearly. That's how the knight works. But another fun mechanic is that, unlike the other pieces, it can jump over them. For example, if I had, let's say, a black-white queen here, if this white queen wanted to take this rook, it couldn't just take, then go rampaging across to the other side of the board. No. It would have to stay. So if this queen took this knight, it would have to... This rook, it would have to stay there. And on its next turn, it can move to the other side. While the taking mechanics are the same with the knight. If there was this pawn in the way and it wanted to take this rook, it could jump over the knight. As you can see here, I can cross this way, then on my way to the rook. It's quite complicated at first, this weird L shape that goes in all sorts of directions. But you get the hang of it soon enough, and hopefully one day you'll be as jumpy as the knight. And the final piece on our list, the pawn. This pawn has the least value, as technically it can move to the least amount of squares. It has the least, how do I say this, agility. Usually it's stuck to one row, like this. For example, it starts on this rank here or this rank here. An easy way to remember that is one from the bottom or top ranks. But the pawn can only move one square at a time, forward, 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 forward. However, a special mechanic is that when it's on its starting base, which is, as I've highlighted before, the 7th and the 2nd row, it can move 2 squares at a time, but only once. From this rank, from this square, I can't move again 2 squares to the 6th rank. That would be impossible. Instead, it would take me 2 moves to get there. But on the starting square, it can move 2, which is really useful. While it may be really weak, you do start with 8 of them on each side, which makes it so that you have quite a lot of pawns, which makes you really, really powerful, and you really need to know how to use them. But the way it captures is different. Let's say I have a bishop on this square, and I have just moved my pawn 2 squares from the starting row, as I just explained. This pawn can go forward, but it can also take diagonally 1 square. For example, this pawn right here can go diagonal and capture this bishop. However, now it's stuck to this column. It cannot go back to this column. It'll have to trudge forward and potentially hope that it can capture another piece to be on its home row. Another important thing to note is that it can only move diagonally 1 square at a time. If I had a queen here on this square, I can't go diagonal 2 squares, no. Only when the queen is on this square or this square can I take it. The pawn can't go backwards or capture backwards. So the black queen would be safe here, 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 or here, and here. But if it was on this square or this square, it could be taken or captured. Another important thing to note is that you can block the pawn with any piece of the game. For example, I could have this white rook, its own team, blocking the pawn. The pawn cannot go forward in this situation, as there's already another piece, and it can't jump ahead like the knight can. Instead, it's stuck here until its team frees it, or let's say if there was another piece, the black rook here, wait for the black rook to move, or for it to capture something so that it can move to the other side. That's the pawn in summary. Now let's go to how the board is set. The board is set with the black pieces starting on the top if you are white, and the white pieces starting on the top if you're black. So basically, your opponent will always be at the top and you will always be at the bottom. But that has nothing to do with the actual result itself. The black pieces are always on the 7th and 8th rank. The pawns are always in front, kind of like a line of smaller soldiers with the better and more important ones at the back. White pieces always start at the 2nd and 1st rank. The order goes with the 2 rooks at the corners of the board, followed by 2 knights, 2 bishops, and the queen and king. This goes for both sides. However, I've seen a lot of people get confused with the king and queen placings. They get confused with which way they should go, whether or not the king should be on the light square and the queen on the darker ones. However, an easy way to remember this is that the opposite color square is what the king should be on, and a matching color square is what the queen should be on. So as you can see here, the black queen is on a dark square, the white queen on a light square, the black king on a light square, the white king on a dark square. That's how it works. Now as you can see here, every other piece other than the knights and the pawns are immobilized, meaning that you should push the pawns first. You can push the knights out first, but that's not really ideal. Essentially, you want to move the pawns first. An ideal situation or perfect position is like this. Let's say black cannot move. Let's say black decides to push. An important rule is that white always goes first. No matter the skill level, age, whatever, white always goes first. Black will never go first. Unlike other games where it relies on age or, experience, this one is always the same. White always starts. Is always the same. White always starts. Now let's give white an ideal situation, the golden position, where white will almost always win if you don't sacrifice or blunder a piece, where your opponent captures a piece for free. So let's say we push, black pushes, we push, and black thinks that it's more fun to just move his rook around in the corner. So we'll let him do that. Once you push the pawns out first, you want to move the knight. Now, the knight can move to 2 squares, these 2 here, one on the side of the board and one closer to the middle. Now, the knight has 2 options. It can go to this way or this way, to this side of the board. It can go to the side. The knight can go 2 ways. One is to the side of the board, and one is closer to the center where the action is. As I have told you before, the knight doesn't really want to be on the side of the board where it's isolated and it has literally almost no squares to move to. It wants to be at the center of the board where it has more, where it's able to control the center. The knight wants to move to the center of the board where it's closer to the action and closer to the center, which means it has more places to move to. So that's where we'll move it. The rook moves back, and we do the same with the other knight. If we wanted to, we could put it on this square here, but as I told you before, it will only have 2 squares to move to, which is not very ideal. Here, it has 5 squares to move to, much better than 2. Black moves, and now we develop or push the bishops. It doesn't really matter what order you push the bishops in, but what matters is the square. Now you could move here, but this isn't really the best move. It's a fine move, it's not going to make you lose the game instantly, but it's not as good as this move here. The reason is that it blocks the queen from being able to come to the center, which is these 4 squares here, and come into the action. But if the bishop was here, not only would it be able to spy on enemy pieces, but also be able to go back and forth, and generally has more control here. Black moves, and we do the same with the other bishop. But now it gets confusing. What do we do now? We've already pushed all of our pieces here. There's no real reason to push any of these as there's no purpose. But what we can do now, do something known as castling. Castling is when you move your king over to the side of the board where it's protected and basically move the rook around. There are two ways you can castle. You can castle kingside, which is shorter, or queenside. A few rules is that when you castle, the path has to be clear. For example, I couldn't castle with a knight on its starting square or a bishop back here. It needs to be a clear path. When you castle kingside, it has to be that the king hasn't moved at all, or the rook on the side that you want to castle towards hasn't moved as well. For example, if I move the king, I cannot castle at all. But if I move this rook, I can still castle, but it would have to be with this rook here, which hasn't moved. If both the rooks have moved, you cannot castle at all. So let's see what castling looks like. The king moves 1, 2 to this square here, and as you can see, the rook also does the same automatically. It moves 1, 2 to this side of the king. However, let's say the white queen goes forward, and black moves back. We can now castle queenside, as there is no queen, no knight, no bishop. And that means you can castle queenside. This is when the king goes 1, 2. However, the rook now has to go 1, 2, 3 around the king. It started off here, moved 1, over the king, 2, and then 3. Now the way to win the game is to checkmate the black king. Or in our case, the black king. That is basically when you have the opponent king surrounded. It has no safe square to move to. And any potential square it moves to, it could get captured, including the square that it's currently on. While you may not be able to actually capture the king, that's still the way to win, with all your pieces aiming at the king. Not all your pieces, but enough so that the king cannot move. So now that you've had an introduction to chess, don't tell me. So now that you've had an introduction to chess, it's time you go out there and play your very first game. Have fun! Write down your top learning in the comment box below. I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye!